For your presentation. I'll quickly launch us into the Q&A. I've heard from both of you loud and clear that we have some serious problems with climate change that is here and has been here for a while, and it's impacting all sectors, particularly air, rail, and roads. And I heard in your presentation in both cases that, of course, the greatest impact is in rural Canada and the north and isolated parts of the country. So I'd like to hear from both of you, what are some of the solutions besides just money? Because money is one thing, and we all appreciate that. We hear all the time from witnesses that government has to invest more, but I'd like to hear from both of you where that more would be. And if we look at the history of our country, and most countries, usually trains, planes, and automobiles eventually go where there's economic development. And the truth of the matter is, from my perspective, over the last 8 years or so, we've done everything we can to put obstacles in developing our natural resources, our mineral and critical resources. So unless we unleash that in order to justify unleashing the billions required to do all the wonderful things that we need to do to respond to climate change, I think it'll be difficult to arrive to a particular destination. So I know I've put a lot into those comments and those questions, but I'd like to start with Professor Gradek, and then we'll go to Professor Prentice.
Thank you, Senator. You can't talk about one solution or one issue, which is mineral development and making sure we have access to those minerals and have it export, without talking about transportation. One begets the other. Chicken and egg. Which do you do first? And I think that what we've done in Canada to date has been really looking at doing mineral exploitation, mineral development, and we'll use the existing infrastructure, upgrade it to a certain degree, and support the movement of that mineral product from its source to destination. So we really haven't spent a lot of time and a lot of effort to really streamline and optimize the transportation system required to support the development of those natural resources that the world so dearly wants from Canada. And I think the time is coming where areas such as Ontario's Ring of Fire, whether it's the timber operations in northern mid-range Canada, whether it's the agricultural support that we have in the prairies, the breadbasket of the world, there is a need for us to really go back and look at the root cause of some of our issues that we have in supporting the development and the export of some of those products. So the answer, yes, you're right, the answer is money to develop it. But I think we need a vision before we need the money. And I think that's where, looking at the work that's been done by the National Task Force on Supply Chain last year, they started to basically create the embryonic version of that vision, of that strategy, and understanding what is the value of transportation in ensuring we have a globally admired and a globally supported supply chain. And I think that there's a few things we have to do concurrently with investing money that basically needs to be done, and those are things such as visibility, resilience, all those crazy things we talk about that Professor Prentice and I keep talking about to our students in supply chain, and talk about how do we in fact look at building a more robust supply chain that has stability and reliability built into it. And yes, that needs a vision. And I think one of the issues we've been talking about is how do we as a Canadian industry get over the issue that we have in terms of data sharing. We are in a digital world. Our supply chains are going digital. We need to be able to, in fact, look at information sharing and getting everybody to participate properly in a supply chain visibility exercise. And I think that's our biggest hurdle, is really understanding, how do we get enough data into our networks, into our understanding of supply chain to basically make sure we understand what resilience means. And we have to get over the fact that Canadians don't like sharing competitive data. Nobody likes sharing competitive data because it's all about market share and it's all about revenues and profits and shareholders looking at return. But data is really, to me, is really the key driver of getting better performance out of our supply chains, out of our resources, and out of our networks. And that's the biggest hurdle. And if you ask me for a solution, I'm not sure there is one just yet, but I think we need to have a debate as to how do we, in fact, get ourselves to a point where it's okay for companies, for members of the supply chain, to share information, to get enough data so that we can build a more robust supply chain.
Professor Gradek.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of LTAs, as Barry knows. And I think that housing is probably the one basic need that needs to be addressed in northern communities, that ships like the LTAs that Barry's been talking about make a lot of sense. Because we basically need to bring housing to the north. And prefab housing is one of Canadian specialties. We know how to build prefab housing. They weigh a lot. And tractor trailers only have 4 to 6 weeks a year to move across those ice roads. So I believe we need a heavy lift capability. So we have the C-17 Globemasters that our friends in defense have. Can those carry housing? Sure. They can bring housing up north. Can't land anywhere, though. Can only land in 1 or 2 airports up north. But we need another vehicle, another way to bring that basic human right of housing to the northern communities, because our current infrastructure, our current road network, current air support network doesn't do it.
Senator Simons, followed by Senator Méville-Duchesne.
I've always been obsessed with airships, but with respect to Dr. Prentice, I actually am going to focus on Professor Gradek today. We're coming up to the anniversary of last Christmas's terrible weather, which socked in the airports in both Toronto and Vancouver. Because of Canada's hub model, we're uniquely vulnerable to weather systems that hit our major airports. And I'm wondering what you can tell me about what you think. I mean, I just toured the Vancouver airport 2 weeks ago. They're ripping out a whole runway to build a new one to be more climate resilient. But what do airports and airlines need to do to make sure that we don't have people trapped on planes at airports for days? And what does that mean also for our cargo system, which also relies on airports, I think, more than a lot of Canadians understand?
Well, I think, what happened, what's been happening over the last 18 months in the aviation domain in Canada has been interesting. It's what I call a trial run of what the future of Canadian climate change is going to look like, and how our airport infrastructure, our aviation infrastructure, is preparing for it. And yes, I would say last winter, failing grade. They would not have passed any one of my courses on any of that stuff, because they really did not do a good job of preparing for it. And I've been fairly vocal in terms of it, trying to figure out and trying to explain to people that, the industry has shot itself in the foot in terms of capabilities of the infrastructure to support the volume of flights that were being put into those airports. And it really was a question of the airlines primarily being very ambitious and being very, very proactive and trying to recoup as much of their lost revenues in the pandemic as they possibly could, and to fly those airplanes as fast and as frequently as they could. So they overtaxed the system. The system wasn't ready. It takes a while for the system to be able to, in fact, support the level of frequencies and the level of services that are being demanded of them by the airlines. So what Air Canada did, what WestJet did, what happened to Sunwing, it really was a question of them, of the carriers really being overly ambitious. And if I look at what's happening this summer, much better, much better. I think the airlines learned their lesson, the airports learned their lesson, that we did not have the mess that we had last summer, this summer. Question would be, one, what's winter going to look like? So I haven't got, my crystal ball isn't working very well these days, and I can't forecast the winter forecast as much as the Weather Network would like me to forecast it. But what are the odds of another bad winter? Define bad. So if I look at last year's and say, okay, that's the new normal, I hate using the term new, but if that's a normal situation, I'm not sure if the airports in Canada and the airlines in Canada recognize that you need to be able to really understand the weather forecasts, react to those forecasts before they actually happen. Don't cut back your flights the morning when you see 20 centimeters of snow in Vancouver. You know that snow is coming. You know it's coming 3 or 4 days ahead of time, anywhere in Canada. We're not living in a vacuum. That's why we have weather forecasters. That's why we pay the people at Environment Canada the money that we pay them to do those forecasts. So react to those forecasts and don't just wait for the morning of to basically say, oops, we're going to have to cancel half of our flights because there's too much snow on the ground. And I think that's what we have to be able to do.
So do you think the places, I mean, we've built our largest airport, Pearson, right on a lake, which has complicated weather patterns. I mean, to rebuild our airport infrastructure would be a colossal and perhaps impossible undertaking. So what do we do to make sure that, I mean, Trudeau Airport as well, but I mean, I think Pearson and Vancouver, because they're right on the water, are more vulnerable, I'm guessing, to weather extremes.
Welcome to Canada. We like building things around water. We love water. And so, yes, pity Edmonton, pity Calgary. But I think that we love to be able to say that, we have pretty airports around pretty landscapes. But we also attract a lot of people around that landscape. And the airports become very congested with people building around those airports.
Yeah.
The airports being built today around the world are isolated. They are away from residential centers. We have airports being built 50, 60, 70 kilometers away from buildings, from infrastructure.
Edmonton did that in the 1960s, so we were very advanced.
But when you talk about what is it that we have to do in terms of our airport infrastructure, I think that we know, and it's a fact within the airport community, that Trudeau Airport is in trouble, space-wise.
Yeah.
Pearson is in trouble, space-wise. Vancouver is in trouble, space-wise. If the forecast of the carriers that we have operating holds true, we will have congestion at those airports. We will have backups. We will have snowstorms snarling those airports, a greater frequency than we've ever had before. So, yeah, we have to figure out a way for us to, in fact, look at matching what demands we put on the airports by the airlines and what the airport's capacity is to handle those flights, because we can't handle the growth that the airlines are putting at the airports today. Yeah. Impossible.
And with Vancouver taking one whole runway out of commission because of climate change, that's a problem.
But that's what airports have to do. If you don't, like Trudeau just finished a 3-month rehab on one of their runways, and they've got 2 more runways to go. And the question is it enough? What that air runway is being conditioned for what type of climate? If it's a climate we've had over the last 5 or 10 years, not good enough. And we may have to go back and revisit it again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And of course, keeping in mind that many of our airport authorities, Professor, are already heavily in debt across the country, so they have to manage that aspect as well. So, Sénatrice Melville-Duchesne.
Monsieur Gradek,
Hello, Mr. Gradek. I'm going to continue in the same line of questioning as my colleague. If you had to speak to an airport in Canada, a large airport, that might be an example in terms of preparedness or a reflection of climate change. You spoke about congestion, but beyond congestion, there is also physical preparation, and I imagine that's the runways. So what airport in Canada, in your opinion, is ahead of others and might, for us as a committee, serve as an interesting example for observation? Great question. It's a question that I've asked. I've asked this to many administrators recently, and everyone had trouble finding 1 or 2 airports that are a model for the future. I would say Ottawa. Ottawa is an example of an airport where there's space. There's space for improvement. There's space to increase space for increased capacity. But if we look at the other airports in Canada, I don't think that many airports were designed and built and operate in this sphere. When we see the increase in air traffic forecasted by the airlines over the next few years, we're going to have a problem at all the major airports. But I'm interested in climate change. Well, climate change, it's impossible to separate out the two. Climate change is inevitable. The increase in traffic, that can be controlled. We can tell airlines, okay, we are at our capacity limit and we cannot accommodate your increased demand, and so we can halt the demand on capacity. So I'm looking at the airport situation as a situation where there's a physical infrastructure, and this is creating issues to provide airport services, and we've seen this in the past 18 months. And on these airports, I'd say that Montreal, Trudeau, Toronto, Pearson, Vancouver are the worst airports to make sure that they have plans in order to address this issue of climate change.
Thank you. Senator Quinn, followed by Senator Cardozo.
Thank you, Chair. I want to come back to John, Mr. Gradek, Professor Gradek. During your presentation, you talked about integrated approach, and we've talked about airports in Vancouver and Toronto and Montreal. And these major airports, of course, are centered around populated areas, big populations, and that tends to be the case across the country. I'll come back to an exception. But in an integrated approach, as you're looking at airports, shouldn't we be also considering how do we take better advantage of infrastructure that we have and then bringing new approaches to using that infrastructure? What I'm getting at is, in my area in New Brunswick, the historic argument about how many airports are in New Brunswick. We're a small population. One could argue we have way too many airports, but we also have billions of dollars invested in highway systems. And you can drive from one side of New Brunswick to the other in 5 hours. And most Canadians in large centers are looking at, an hour or more to get to an airport, and yet they live with that. Shouldn't we have an integrated approach for taking advantage of infrastructure that is in the road side or the rail side, or shouldn't we be investing in that, such as we hear the arguments around Windsor, Quebec corridors? Isn't that at least part of the solution that should be considered?
I think you're right. I think that, one of the things that we have to look at is just, we've only got so much money to spend on transportation infrastructure. The question is getting the biggest bang for the buck that we're spending. And so you look at what are the different modes of transportation that we shouldn't be investing in to support the economic growth and the needs of the population in those communities. And I think that, there has to be some choices that we're making in terms of, some modes of transportation, road transportation, rail transportation, air transportation is, there's a trade-off that has to happen in terms of the infrastructure needed to support those three modes. And I've, for the life of me, been worried about, things like looking at Montreal, Toronto. The largest air corridor we have in Canada, 500 kilometers. Is air the right mode to basically support that type of movement and that type of population shift? And I remember my days at Air Canada when looking at that service and saying, I can't believe it that of all the places in the world that Air Canada is in fact making all that money is on one of the shortest routes in the world, 500, because there's the volume and there's no alternative. And the question is developing an infrastructure that's an alternative mode of transportation that's most cost effective for that marketplace. And so we look at Europe, we look at even places like China, where they've basically taken rail structure and brought in rail as the ideal mode or a better mode of transportation for shorter haul traffic. And I think we haven't crossed the Rubicon on that one yet. I think we have a view that we have high-frequency rail that we want to do in Canada with Via Rail, but that's probably a short-term solution. We need to really look at investing and building rail infrastructure that really can eliminate the need for us to spend a lot of infrastructure dollars on air serving those short-haul markets. So whether it's Calgary, Edmonton, whether it's Montreal, Toronto, whether it's Ottawa, Toronto, there has to be a way that we can, in fact, look at what's the best mode of transportation that we should be investing in to, in fact, serve those small markets. And New Brunswick is a prime example of looking at, the services that we have in New Brunswick. Air services could probably be supplemented by better quality rail services.
There's one view that says we should unleash oil and gas exploration so we have more money in the system to pay for the negative effects of climate change. The other view says that we need to reduce and eventually cap exploration so there's less negative effects of climate change to begin with. Now, I observe that almost all witnesses who come before us at the Senate are calling for some level of large increase of federal government expenditures. And it's everything from investing in national defense to investing in cancer. Yet no one talks about deficit spending. So I really would like people to have a more open discussion about whether they feel we should be doing we should be engaging in deficit spending for these huge projects. So I'd like your thoughts about how we make all this work. And on the airships, I just say perhaps if we started with domestic airship traffic, it might be easier to convince the public that it works rather than talk about the transatlantic or transpacific. But maybe I'll ask Professor Gradek to start.
Yeah, thank you. So that's a 900-pound gorilla in a room. How do we pay for all this? And so the question is, airports can't pay for any of that upgrade. They're sealing their debt. There's no way there's any money left. The money has to come from someplace. Yes, and the traditional answer is, let's go to the feds, let's go to the provincials, and let's get money from them. The question is, there's always a third option, which is really going out to the public markets and talking to us about the governance structure that we have for our airports and really say, is there room for public partnerships in this effort? And my answer to that is yes. And we have Canadian sovereign funds today investing billions of dollars in international airports. The biggest shareholder you have in London Airport is Teachers. Toronto. They are principal shareholder. And they've invested billions of dollars to support the growth of London Airport. Not London, Ontario. London, England. And that, to me, is a proof positive that we have Canadian resources, Canadian funding agencies that have an interest in supporting the air infrastructure, as an example. So let's open it up. Let's see if we can change our governance model for our airports, and let's see if we can get Canadian sovereign funds, as an example, to basically look at investing in our Canadian infrastructure rather than investing in infrastructure in the UK or Dubai or in Singapore or in Hong Kong. And I think that's probably the easiest way to feed this 900-pound gorilla.
Helping develop resources in the north and how that would work. And also, Professor Gradek, what is the answer? Is there an answer to how do we deal with resource development given the climate change issues and the erosion of the infrastructure we have? Is there a good way to, what are the best optimal ways to do this? Or do we just kind of leave resource development in the north and continue with resource development in the south, or not, as the case may be? So either witness, both. Thank you.
Well, let me start, if I could, by simply saying that one of the companies, again, Torgat, they're already at the point where they want to use the airships. They're preparing rare earths, so they're already on board. If you have an airship, they're ready for it. But any base metal would be a candidate. Certainly, we do have some mining in the north, Mary's River, steel, but that's, again, on the coast. There's one in northern Quebec, again, on the coast. But if you want to be inland, the problem is the cost of the infrastructure to get to these locations. So the airships could do that. And what we do is prepare a concentrate. So you're not just taking out rock, and you only move the goods from the mine to the first railhead or the first road, and you transship there. So that's what they have in mind. And certainly it would open up a huge number of places. We know there's lots and lots of mineral deposits that are well known that you just can't afford to get to them because of the access.
Professor Gradek, you get the last word.
Yeah, and I think that, Barry's got a a good point in terms of looking at what's the option do we have to mineral development. And infrastructure, transportation is a key. So road, rail, air, those are very expensive. I think LTAs and been very, very, pardon? Water, and that's where most of the stuff is all set up. Most of those mines are set up around water. But, I think that, if you're talking about inland development where most of these minerals are, we need an alternative method of transportation. I think that LTAs, letter than air, airships, need public policy. We need the government to basically come up and make a very, very strong statement that we are serious about going about lighter than air airships. We have no regulation about airships. How do you build them? How do you manage it? How do you certify a pilot? How do you certify a mechanic? We need that infrastructure. And that's, to me, that's probably the first step in really recognizing that we need an infrastructure method, a transportation infrastructure that's different than what we have today.
This is a serious option
It is.
for resource development.
It is, very much.
Thank you.
On behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank both our witnesses. As you can see, we went over our allotted time, and I think we could have gone on and on. It was very insightful, very helpful. I thank you both, and this meeting is